Beneath the normal internet we all know, like YouTube, Facebook and Google, there lies the dark web, an anonymous, unregulated world with websites not accessible from search engines, a hidden corner of the internet where anything goes for a while. The biggest site on the dark web was Silk Road, an online black market for all kinds of body parts, to weapons to hit men, and most commonly, of all drugs. In fact, Silk Road was dubbed the Amazon of drugs because you could simply go to the Silk Road sites, buy any substance you wanted with just a few clicks, and have it shipped to your doorstep like an Amazon package. But what's perhaps most surprising of all about this is who was behind this illegal empire. Meet Ross Ulbricht. Our story's surprising protagonists. Ross grew up in a loving family in Texas. He was a Boy Scout as a kid, studied physics at university, and was thought of as a very sweet guy by all his friends and family. So imagine their shock when they realized Ross was the criminal mastermind behind the largest online drug empire in history, responsible for over $1.2 billion worth of sales of illegal goods and services. Not just that, but this sweet kid who reportedly paid hitmen to kill his enemies, or did he? To this day, there is debate over whether Ross is guilty or not. So in this video, we're gonna dive into the murky world of the dark web and explore the true story behind the infamous Silk Road marketplace. We're also going to look at how the government really managed to track down Ross, despite the fact that Ross was using the Tor browser, which made him completely anonymous. How do you find someone who can't be trapped? This is a true story, filled with mysteries, twists, and even a couple of corrupt government agents. Welcome to the fascinating story of the Silk Road Empire. Ross Ulbricht wanted to change the world, but his life so far had been a series of almosts. He tried several business ideas but never quite got anywhere with them, and he was starting to feel like his life was passing him by. However, there was one business idea Ross kept coming back to: an online marketplace where people could buy or sell anything imaginable, with no limits or restrictions. Now you see, Ross was a staunch libertarian and would regularly debate with people about why the government shouldn't have so much control over people's lives, especially when it came to drugs, which he felt should all be legalized. He'd say it's not the government's right to tell people what they can or can't put in their bodies. And whenever someone tried to argue back about safety concerns, Ross would say, well, should we outlaw Big Macs from McDonald's too? Because they make people gain weight and have heart attacks and die. Or what about cars? They kill millions every year. And so to Ross, the idea of a marketplace where people could buy and sell whatever they wanted, make a lot of money. In his view, it was also a way to free people and help the world. After some research, Ross discovered there was a web browser called Tor, which allowed you to access the dark web where you couldn't be tracked or traced. The Tor browser was actually developed by the US Navy as a way to communicate privately over the internet by concealing a user's real IP address and identity. By using this, Ross realized people would be able to buy things online without the government being able to see what they were doing. But at first, Ross didn't go any further with the idea because there was no way to accept payments online that couldn't easily be traced. For example, credit cards would keep a log of every transaction someone made and be linked to their bank accounts. So for a little while, the site remained just an idea in Ross's mind until the summer of 2010. When Ross came across a new technology called Bitcoin, a digital currency, which could be transferred anonymously, thus allowing people to buy whatever they wanted without a trace. It was exactly what he needed. So from his bedroom, Ross began working on his new online marketplace. He decided to call it Silk Road, named after a famous trade route that started over 2,000 years ago, that people used for centuries to carry all kinds of different goods. Understandably, Ross was very wary of anyone knowing about the site he was building, which unfortunately meant he had to build it all by himself. The only person he told at first was his girlfriend Julia. Now his girlfriend was a little concerned, but Ross reassured her that thanks to the Tor web browser and Bitcoin, it would all be completely back to him. As for making the site itself, it was slow work to figure everything out, as building an entire online marketplace by himself was a massive job. But Ross was determined, and he worked very long hours to make it a reality, sat at his laptop coding all day, and most of the nights, he would just occasionally take a break to watch one of his favorite shows, Breaking Bad, the story of a normal guy who becomes a drug kingpin. However, as Ross was finally nearing completion of the Silk Road sites, he realized he had a problem. He needed some product to actually sell on his new marketplace. There was no use building the platform if when people first came, there was nothing to buy. so Ross rented out a building in the middle of nowhere and began growing his own magic mushrooms, using a book that was essentially a dummy's guide to building your own mushroom farm. This would be the first product to ever be sold on the Silk Road marketplace by early 2011. After a year of work on the sites, he was ready to launch it to the world. He'd added categories for all different types of drugs to begin with. The only item listed was the mushrooms he'd grown himself, but the plan was that sellers from all over the world would list their own items for sale. Of course, in order to attract both buyers and sellers to the sites, he needed to promote it. Remember, sites on the dark web are not picked up by search engines, and it's also not like Ross could just run some Facebook or Google ads to help find customers for his illegal marketplace. So to get the word out about his new sites, Ross went on to several internet forums to spread the words. For example, he joined a site called The Shroomery, for fans of shrooms, and made a post, pretending to be a customer interested in using Silk Road. The reason he did this was, so it didn't seem like he was promoting his own websites. He knew that, by casually name-dropping, Silk Road people on the forums would go and check it out for themselves, and they did. Orders soon started coming in. Now this was all happening at the beginning of working at a little bookstore in Texas called Good Wagon Books, but this worked out really well, because it meant Ross had everything he needed to easily ship out his shrooms, because he was able to use the bookshop's padded envelopes and label maker. He also used a vacuum sealer that normally would keep food fresh to wrap the mushrooms up. So Ross was in business, and it was initially shipping off orders twice a week, but as the site's popularity grew through word of mouth, Ross soon had to start mailing shipments out every day as more and more orders were coming in. But even better than that, other people had started selling items on Silk Road. Other dealers had created their own listings with everything from weed to coke to ecstasy, and of course, more products for sale helped attract even more buyers. And Silk Road initially took a 6.23 commission on every single trade, in order to make people feel more comfortable using the sites. Ross also built a rating system where buyers and sellers could review each other, similar to eBay's feedback system or Amazon reviews. Ross worked tirelessly on the sites and was constantly exhausted, but he was also incredibly excited by its growth when he first made the site. He honestly hadn't been sure if anyone would use it at all, and yet in just a couple of months, he'd already made thousands of dollars in revenue. He told his girlfriend, Julia, about the progress of the sites. Although she was slightly less excited, Judy was concerned by the fact harder drugs were now being sold on Silk Road, especially when she realized someone had even started selling heroin on there. Her doubts about the whole thing started to grow, and she asked Ross, what if someone overdoses or sellers send out stuff that's been tampered with or laced with something else? Ross confidently reminded her of the rating system. He said, if someone sells bad drugs, they'd get a bad rating and no one will buy from them again. Julia simply said, yeah, but how are they supposed to give a bad rating if... While Silk Road had been growing fairly quickly through word-of-mouth, growth started to get crazy. Once Gawker wrote an article about the sites. Right after that article went live, many other news sites started writing about Silk Road as well, describing it as an underground website that lets you buy any drug imaginable. Even big TV news networks like ABC and NBC began talking about the site that's bringing it even more attention. Thousands of drugs came through the black website called Silk Road. Of course, not all that attention was good. We're now watching the sites and beginning to investigate who was running. New tracking whoever was behind it would be extremely difficult. Meanwhile, Ross started working on Silk Road full-time. He had no choice really. It was going so much quicker than he ever expected. The site now had hundreds of sellers and thousands of buyers, and whilst Ross had sold all the mushrooms he'd grown, he was now making commissions on every sale from the sites. As more money rolled in, it was exhilarating. But one morning he opened his laptop, and there Ross tried to rationalize that it was an American's constitutional right to have a gun, so this wasn't a problem. However, once again his girlfriend Julia saw it differently. Ross, you have to stop. Would need to buy a gun. Anonymously. Ross and Julia argued about this, and Julie went off to her friend Erica's house to vent. Julia had become increasingly paranoid about everything Ross was doing, and so she confided in her friend Erica about Ross running Silk Road. She made Erica promise that she'd never say a word about it to anyone. and for a while it seemed like she'd kept that promise. He saw a public post on his like to know about Ross Ulbricht's drug websites. Immediately panic filled his body and he broke down in tears. A wave of emotions crashed over him. Firstly, he was angry. Julie had told someone else that he was running the sites. Secondly, betray his trust like that. But mostly, the strongest emotion he felt was fear. He immediately deleted Erica's post off his Facebook wall and phoned her in tears, begging her never to mention it to anyone again. As for why Erica had made the post calling out Ross in the first place, it had all started when Eric had had a bad trip from a substance she bought of Silk Road, and when she got back from the hospital she'd got into a fight with both Julia and Ross, which had ended with Ross telling Erica to leave Erica in an intoxicated state, had then posted on Facebook as revenge. Luckily for Ross, he'd seen the post quickly enough, meaning the post was deleted. Before hardly anyone saw it, and it had been able to see it anyway, the crisis seemed to have been averted. Extremely anxious Julia and Ross as to let Ross keep running the site from ultimatum, but he had to close the site after the Eric incident. Ross decided just as a precaution. And so Ross went to Bondi Beach in Australia to the Lunar New Year. He even backpacked the traveler seemed along running the biggest illegal site of dollars in Bitcoin. Life was good for that. Ross often had to rely on internet sites, and he was understandably anxious, realizing what he was doing. Thus of the internet cafes, and he also pressing a certain key he could in case it felt like anyone was looking getting caught, was especially terrifying all around the world, since Silk Road people had been known to get hanged for the site's rapid growth, also build an entire marketplace by himself. One particularly bad coding mistake purchased something on Silk Road, Ross gaining money. Ross had no choice but to road while he desperately tried to fix clock on the site trying to manage all. I would just absolutely love to have seen what it turned out to be, no matter what your thoughts on Ross. You've seen what can happen if you all agree. We want to keep our personal. That's why I want to tell you about a browser extension that can keep you direct in real time before they cause websites unwanted notifications, sketchy threats as opposed to traditional sites and files before you access our browser, is where we store payment addresses and more. It's crucial to keep real-time protection and alerts, making vulnerable info they already have over one. Recently even featured by Google, I've started using it and added my family took control of my online safety, and I want to take control of your browsing/magnets media and get a limited only $5 a month to keep 5. The US government was devoting more and more resources to the search for Dread Pirate Roberts, but considering multiple different government agencies were working on the case of Silk Road like the FBI and the DEA, it might surprise you that the biggest breakthrough of all came from an IRS agent. Making a simple Google search, Gary Alford was a tax inspector who'd been assigned to the Silk Road case to try and track some of the money being laundered. However, he had pretty much no knowledge of Bitcoin Tour or anything else to do with Silk Road. What Gary did have in his favor was that he was very detail-oriented and he never missed anything. Gary also liked to think outside the box. His favorite ever criminal case was how they caught the serial killer Son of Sam, who went on a killing spree in New York in the 70s. For while no matter how many detectives they put on the case, nobody could figure out who the killer was. But then one day, an officer decided to take a different approach and look for cars in the nearby area that would receive parking tickets around the same time of the murders. The logic being that the murderer would hardly be concerned about running back to top up the parking meter. Whilst in the middle of killing someone, they found a pattern where the same car had received parking tickets on the night of, and always located fairly close to the scene of the crime. They then traced the owner of the car, and that led them straight to the murderer, who confessed Gary liked this case because it proved you could outperform more experienced people by looking at the problem differently. And Gary was convinced the founder of Silk Road must have left a similarly small mistake behind the digital equivalent of a parking ticket. Gary started his search by asking what's the earliest post about Silk Road on the internet, since he figured whoever started the site would have had to drop off interest in the first place. So Gary went to Google, typed the Silk Road web address into the search box, and using advanced search, he filtered by dates looking for results only from early 2011, which is when the Silk Road was rumored to have started. Only a few search results came up, and one of them was a post from a user called Altoid on a forum called the Shroomery. The post sounded more like a user, not the creator of the site, but it was the first record online of someone mentioning Silk Road, so Gary searched for other posts by a user called Altoid from around the same date, and stumbled across a post on another forum called Bitcoin Talk, where someone with the same outward username had posted, "Has anyone seen Silk Road yet? It's kind of like an anonymous Amazon.com." Gary thought it was interesting that the first mentions of Silk Road online were both coming from this same username, and this person had been promoting Silk Road on multiple different forums right around the time that Silk Road launched. So Gary looked through Altoid's post history on the forum, and a few months after Silk Road started, Altoid had made another post, saying it needed for a Bitcoin. It was a job ad for a Bitcoin-related project, but inside the post read, "If interested, please send your answers to the following questions to rossalbrecht@gmail.com. Now when Gary told his colleagues about these findings, they dismissed that. They said just because this user was the first one to publicly post about Silk Road didn't mean he was the creator. Which is true, they certainly needed more evidence to prove anything, but the more Gary looked into this Ross Ulbricht's character, the more convinced he became that this was the guy behind Silk Road first, by searching the name Ross Ulbricht. Gary found Ross's YouTube channel containing videos about libertarianism, along with a saved video about how to get away with stealing, but also Ross would use the username, "Oh yeah Ross," which was interesting because whenever Dread Pirate Roberts messaged anyone or wrote on the Silk Road forum, he'd always write, "Yeah, not yes, oh yeah, always." Just, yeah, it was a small detail, but perhaps more than just a coincidence. Secondly, Gary found Ross's LinkedIn profile, which had anti-government posts. Russ had written, "The most widespread and systematic use of force is amongst institutions and governments, so this is my current point of efforts. The best way to change the government is to change the minds of the governed. To that end, I'm creating an economic simulation to give people a first-hand experience of what it would be like to live in a world without the systematic use of force." Thirdly, they found a coding question related to Tor posted on Stack Overflow, which had been posted by a user called Ross Ulbricht, but within a minute of posting he changed his username to Frosty. Instead, clearly he realized he'd slipped up by using his real name, and so that's why he changed it right away. Gary couldn't shake the feeling that this was the guy they were looking for. So Gary asked a colleague who worked for the Department of Homeland Security to do a search on Ross Ulbricht's name, and they found a recent incident on his file where he'd ordered fake IDs online that had been intercepted when Ross had been questioned by an officer about this. He made a comment about how hypothetically anyone could go on a website called Silk Road and buy them. Why Ross said that is anyone's guess. Maybe he was trying to make the point that buying fake IDs wasn't that big of a deal these days, or maybe he just got overconfident that Silk Road could never be traced to him. But either way, Gary felt this whole thing was suspicious. Now of course, all these different details still weren't conclusive evidence. Ross Ulbricht was the creator and owner of Silk Road. But here's the thing, other important details about the case hadn't been shared with Gary. To be honest, nobody expected this IRS agent would crack the case that other agencies had been working on for over 2 years, so they hadn't bothered to fill him in on recent developments, you see. Whilst Gary had been doing this research, the FBI had managed to find out the IP address of the server Silk Road was hosted on. Using that IP address was hosted in a data center in Iceland, and by working with the Icelandic authorities, the FBI were able to infiltrate the Silk Road server now as for exactly how the government found the service IP address in the first place. That's a bit of a controversial issue. Some believe the NSA had some involvement and used an illegal spying tactic that would have infringed on Ross's Fourth Amendment rights. However, the government denied this and said the way they were able to get access to the server was because of vulnerabilities in Silk Road's code which leaked the server's IP address. This is definitely possible because, as we've already established, Silkworth's code had plenty of problems because of how quickly it had been developed by Ross, who'd initially been working on it all by himself. Either way, now that the FBI had tracked down the Silk Road server in Iceland, they could access a lot of crucial data. Most importantly of all, they could see activity on the server. Like whenever the Silk Road admin logged in or out, the logs showed the most recent admin login had come from an internet cafe in San Francisco. Whilst this was a major breakthrough, the FBI still didn't have any leads on who the hell Dread Pirate Roberts actually was, and that's when they got a call from Gary at the IRS. Gary got on a group call with agents from other departments working on the case, like the DEA and FBI, and he laid out everything he'd found. Gary explained that this person with the username Altoid had been the first one to mention Silk Road online, and he'd made multiple posts about Silk Road on different forums. Almost like he was promoting the site when it first began. Gary said that the user had slipped up and on. One of his later posts included his personal email, Ulbricht Gmail. Gary then went on to explain how on Stack Overflow, a user had posted a coding question related to Tor under the name Ulbricht, but then a minute later changed the name to the pseudonym Frosty. At that exact moment, one of the other agents on the call cut Gary off and said, "Wait, did you just say Frosty?" Gary was a little frustrated. He still had more to explain. "Yes," I said, "Frosty. But why are you focusing on that part?" Gary asked. The agent replied, "When we got the server from Iceland, we found that both the server and the computer that belongs to DPR had both been given the same name, Frosty." There was a brief silence on the call. The dot was starting to connect. Gary then added that he tracked where Ross was currently living because of the incident with the fake IDs on his record. However, when Gary shared Ross's current address with the FBI, they couldn't believe it. Ross was living in San Francisco, just a couple of blocks from the internet cafe where they tracked the Silk Road admin IP.